In the glittering halls of Victorian high society, beneath chandeliers and velvet drapes, a curious obsession quietly took root. It was not a political scandal or a new fashion, but a shimmering white powder hailed as a miracle of modern science. Cocaine. Praised as a tonic for fatigue, a cure for melancholy, and even a spark for creativity, it became the secret indulgence of aristocrats, writers, and intellectuals alike. Yet behind the elegance and confidence of an empire at its peak lay a dangerous experiment, a fleeting craze that history has nearly erased from collective memory. Imagine walking into a glittering ballroom in London at the height of the Victorian age. Gas lamps glow against polished mirrors, gowns swish across the marble floors, and violins carry melodies that float like perfume in the air. Champagne flows freely, cigars burn in crystal ashtrays, and in a quiet corner, just beyond the chatter of aristocrats, something far more intoxicating than wine or brandy is being passed around. A fine white powder, laid out like a treasure on silver trays, consumed not in secrecy, but in celebration. This was cocaine, once hailed not as a dangerous vice, but as a fashionable miracle of modern science. To us, it might sound shocking, even absurd. Today, cocaine conjures images of crime, addiction, and underground trade. But in the mid to late 19th century, it was not only legal but admired, endorsed by doctors, promoted by scientists, and adored by the very upper crust of society. For a brief but dazzling moment in history, cocaine was the darling of Victorian high society, a substance that promised energy, sophistication, and a glimpse into the future of medicine. This forgotten craze reveals the strange, often contradictory ways people in history embraced intoxicants, and it shows us how the line between medicine and indulgence, healing and harm, can blur until society is intoxicated not just by the drug, but by its own illusions of progress. The story of cocaine in Victorian times begins not in London's drawing rooms, but in the mountains of South America, where the coca plants had been chewed for centuries by indigenous peoples of the Andes. For them, coca leaves were not a luxury or a symbol of wealth, but a practical tool of survival. But a practical tool of survival. High in the thin mountain air, coca provided stamina, reduced hunger, and eased the aches of labor. It was deeply woven into spiritual rituals and everyday life. European explorers noticed this habit, but for a long time, coca remained little more than an exotic curiosity to outsiders. That changed in 1859 when a German chemist named Albert Niemann managed to isolate the active alkaloid from coca leaves. He named it cocaine. Niemann himself described its numbing effects when applied to the tongue, a property that would soon revolutionize medicine. Here was a substance unlike anything doctors had known, a natural stimulant, a pain reliever, and at least at first glance, a wonder drug. By the 1860s and 70s, cocaine was entering European and American medical circles, and nowhere did it find more eager champions than among the Victorians. This was an age obsessed with science, progress, and discovery. The Victorians prided themselves on taming nature through technology, on transforming crude plants into refined marvels. Cocaine fit perfectly into this narrative. Here was the essence of a mysterious foreign plant, transformed into pure white crystals that spoke of modernity and sophistication. Physicians began to prescribe cocaine for all manner of ailments: toothaches, fatigue, melancholy, even morphine addiction. The great neurologist Sigmund Freud wrote passionately about it in the 1880s, extolling its ability to lift mood, sharpen focus, and restore vigor. He recommended it to friends, colleagues, and even his own fiancée. Freud's enthusiasm was hardly unique. Across Europe, doctors praised cocaine as a near-universal remedy. But beyond the clinic, cocaine began to make its way into the parlours and drawing rooms of high society. In Victorian London and Paris, aristocrats were already fascinated by exotic luxuries, Turkish tobacco, Indian teas, Caribbean rum. Cocaine, with its mysterious South American origins and its modern scientific polish, was the newest thrill. Unlike alcohol, which could leave one sloppy or dull, cocaine promised energy, wit, and elegance. It was the drug of conversation, of intellectual sparkle, of nights that seemed endless. One of the most famous vehicles for cocaine's rise was not powder alone, but drink. In France, Angelo Mariani created a wine infused with coca leaf extract, Vin Mariani. Advertised as a tonic for body and mind, it quickly became a sensation across Europe. Popes, princes, and politicians endorsed it, sending glowing testimonials. Queen Victoria herself was said to be fond of it. Imagine the monarch of the British Empire sipping a coca-infused wine to relax after long state affairs. Such was the reach of this craze. Not to be outdone, English society soon followed, experimenting with coca tonics, lozenges, and powders. Pharmacies openly sold cocaine products, and advertisements promised relief from exhaustion and a boost of vitality. To wealthy Victorians, cocaine was not seen as a vice, but as a fashionable accessory, a marker of modern living, much like a fine watch or a Parisian gown. At glittering soirees, one might find silver snuff boxes not filled with tobacco, but with neat lines of cocaine. It was not unusual for ladies and gentlemen to share a pinch between dances, praising its ability to banish fatigue and keep the party alive. For the Victorian elite, cocaine seemed to fit perfectly with the demands of their social world, endless evenings of conversation, performance, and appearance. Unlike alcohol, it left one clear-eyed and sharp, or so it seemed. But beneath the glamour, the dangers of cocaine were already present. Even in its early years, reports emerged of sleeplessness, paranoia, and physical decline. Freud himself, after years of enthusiastic promotion, began to witness the destructive effects in some of his patients, yet society was slow to recognize the risks. For many Victorians, the dazzling promise of cocaine blinded them to its darker side. This was a culture that believed deeply in progress and modern science, and the very purity of cocaine, white, crystalline, refined, seemed to embody that faith. How could something born from the laboratories of Europe, praised by doctors and embraced by queens, be harmful? And so the craze continued, with cocaine becoming not only a medicine and a stimulant, but a cultural symbol of the Victorian age's confidence in its own achievements. Of course, the story does not end with champagne and ballrooms. By the late 19th century, cracks began to show. Cocaine's addictive potential grew harder to ignore. Patients who had taken it for pain or fatigue returned to their doctors with worsened conditions, unable to function without ever increasing doses. Some of the very physicians who had prescribed it now began to warn against its dangers. The medical journals that once sang its praises shifted tone, speaking of caution, even alarm. Yet in high society, the allure persisted. Much like smoking in later decades, cocaine retained its glamour long after its risks were known. Writers, artists, and socialites embraced it as part of their lifestyle, weaving it into the mythology of decadence that defined the fin de cycle. In drawing rooms and private clubs, whispers of its dangers only added to its mystique. As we peer back into this forgotten craze, it is easy to laugh at the naivety of the Victorians. How could they have been so blind to the dangers? But history teaches us that every age has its own illusions, its own substances it embraces as harmless or even beneficial, only to discover their cost later. Cocaine in the Victorian era was not merely a drug, it was a mirror of society's dreams, fears, and blind spots. And so, in the heart of the Victorian world, beneath the chandeliers and behind the velvet curtains, the white powder sparkled like a secret jewel, promising brilliance but hiding ruin. The cocaine craze of high society was both a symptom of the age's ambition and a warning about the seductive power of progress when it forgets its own limits. By the 1880s, cocaine had become more than just a curious medical experiment. It was a social phenomenon. In London, Paris, and Vienna, the drug slipped into the bloodstream of high culture itself. The wealthy and the fashionable did not merely consume it, they celebrated it. Just as champagne toasts marked triumphs and cigars sealed deals, cocaine became the quiet companion at salons, clubs, and private gatherings. It was not uncommon for members of the aristocracy to keep small, ornate vials of cocaine in their pockets, produced with the same flourish as a gentleman's watch or a lady's fan. It became a symbol of refinement, a token of one's modernity. After all, this was not a crude vice like gin or opium, both associated with the poor and the desperate. Cocaine, pure and crystalline, seemed elevated, almost noble. The Victorian elite, in their pursuit of elegance, found cocaine uniquely suited to their lifestyle. Long evenings of theatre, opera, and parties demanded stamina, and the drug provided exactly that. Tired courtiers could revive themselves with a quick sniff. Weary hosts could ensure their energy held long past midnight. Even the intellectual class was not immune. Writers and scholars experimented with the powder, praising its ability to keep the mind sharp and the pen moving. One striking example was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. In the stories, Holmes famously injects himself with cocaine when bored or unstimulated, a detail drawn from the cultural atmosphere of the time. For Doyle, cocaine represented the restless energy of intellect unchecked, a symbol of both brilliance and danger. Readers accepted this quirk without shock because cocaine was already a familiar part of the cultural fabric. But the craze was not confined to powders and vials. As the drug spread, entrepreneurs found inventive ways to package it. Tonics, syrups, and lozenges crowded the shelves of pharmacies, all promising miraculous cures. Cocaine toothache drops, advertised in newspapers, claimed to soothe children's pain instantly. Coca lozenges were marketed as aids for singers and speakers, protecting the voice from strain. There was even cocaine-laced cigarettes, sold as unrefreshing alternatives to ordinary tobacco. And then there was Coca-Cola. Though the famous drink would later reformulate, its original recipe in the 1880s included coca leaf extract, giving consumers a gentle, stimulant effect. Marketed as a healthful beverage, it embodied the same paradox as Vin Mariani, a fusion of medicine and pleasure, packaged as progress. For the Victorians, such innovations were not suspicious, but thrilling, evidence of science's ability to improve daily life. At the heart of this craze lay a Victorian faith in science as saviour. The 19th century had seen astonishing advances: electricity, telegraphs, anaesthetics, antiseptics. It was an age intoxicated with discovery, convinced that each year brought humanity closer to mastery over nature. Cocaine seemed one more jewel in the crown of progress, a substance that promised to banish pain, fatigue, even sorrow itself. Doctors embraced it enthusiastically, sometimes recklessly. Freud's glowing writings are well known, but he was far from alone. Surgeons used cocaine as a local anesthetic, a revolutionary breakthrough that spared patients the agony of certain procedures. General practitioners prescribed it for melancholy, for indigestion, for exhaustion, and one medical journal even suggested it as a treatment for seasickness. The sheer breadth of its application spoke less to its actual effectiveness than to the era's desperation for universal cures. But while physicians lauded its benefits, the real stage for cocaine's glamour remained the drawing rooms of the rich. Accounts from the period describe gatherings where trays of powder were passed as casually as cigars, where elegant women tapped small mirrors and men exchanged snuff spoons. To partake was not to risk scandal, but to signal sophistication. It was as though the drug itself had been ennobled by the approval of doctors, scientists, and royalty. The paradox, of course, was that beneath this elegance lay addiction. Though the word addiction was not fully formed in the modern sense, its symptoms were unmistakable. Some users found themselves unable to sleep, their minds racing with anxious thoughts. Others developed paranoia, convinced of plots and betrayals. Physical decline set in as appetites diminished and bodies wasted. But in a society accustomed to masking discomfort behind appearances, these signs were often hidden or ignored. Even Freud, who initially praised cocaine as a cure for morphine dependency, watched in horror as some of his patients spiraled into worse conditions. One close friend to whom he recommended the drug developed a devastating addiction that ruined his health. Freud himself would later step back from his early enthusiasm, though the damage was already done. Cocaine had embedded itself too deeply in both medicine and society to be easily dislodged. Meanwhile, in the social world, cocaine began to acquire an aura of decadence. Just as absinthe had become linked with the Bohemian artists of Paris, cocaine grew associated with late-night excesses, whispered affairs, and the secret lives of the elite. To partake was not only to appear modern, but to flirt with the forbidden, to dance on the edge of a new and dangerous thrill. In London, gossip columns hinted at noble families who dabbled too deeply. In Paris, cabaret songs made sly references to the white powder. Writers began to weave it into tales of moral decline and hidden vice. And yet, this very aura only made cocaine more alluring. For the Victorians, who lived in a society bound by rigid etiquette and public propriety, the thrill of breaking taboos was irresistible. The cocaine craze thus existed in tension. On one hand, a miracle drug celebrated in clinics and royal courts. On the other, a shadowy indulgence whispered about in salons and boudoirs. This duality reflected the contradictions of Victorian society itself, an age of progress and repression, science and superstition, grandeur and hypocrisy. By the 1890s, however, cracks in the facade had grown too wide to ignore. Cases of overdose and ruin began to surface with greater frequency. Medical journals that once praised cocaine now published cautionary tales. Governments, alarmed by the rising misuse, began to consider regulation. Slowly, the tide of enthusiasm receded, replaced by unease. And yet, even as the dangers became clear, the memory of its glamour lingered. For many in high society, cocaine had not merely been a drug but a lifestyle, a symbol of their age's confidence and excess. The very name carried with it the echo of late-night conversations, of brilliance that burned too bright and too briefly. Looking back, the Victorian cocaine craze seems almost surreal. That a drug now so firmly associated with crime and ruin was once praised by doctors, endorsed by royalty, and consumed in glittering ballrooms feels like a contradiction too great to believe. But history is often stranger than our assumptions. Cocaine's brief reign over Victorian high society reveals both the optimism and the blindness of an age that believed it could master anything, even the substances that mastered them. The late Victorian world was one of contradictions, and nowhere was this more evident than in its relationship with intoxicants. While the streets of London were plagued by the spectre of gin lanes and moralists railed against the perils of drunkenness among the poor, the wealthy dabbled freely in their own fashionable stimulants. It was an age that liked to preach sobriety while secretly indulging in its own escapes. Cocaine fits seamlessly into this pattern. It was not the drink of the gutter or the pipe of the opium den. It was refined, discreet, and above all, respectable. To understand why cocaine was so quickly embraced, one must remember the moral geography of Victorian life. Respectability was everything. What separated the elite from the masses was not merely wealth, but the ability to frame one's indulgences as cultured rather than vulgar. Where the poor staggered through alleys drunk on gin, the rich lifted crystal glasses of wine infused with coca leaves. Where sailors smoked opium in shadowy dens, duchesses and dukes took delicate pinches of cocaine from silver spoons. The substance itself mattered less than the narrative surrounding it. Cocaine's story was one of modern science, exotic mystery, and medical endorsement, three qualities irresistible to a class desperate to justify its pleasures. Even Queen Victoria's supposed enjoyment of coca wine lent the craze a moral shield. If the monarch herself could partake, surely it was no vice. In this way, cocaine became less a drug and more a badge of status. It whispered of global connection, of one's ability to access the wonders of distant lands and the latest fruits of European laboratories. To take cocaine was to step beyond the limits of ordinary existence, to align oneself with progress. But for all its glamour, cocaine was also profoundly Victorian in another sense. It revealed the era's deep anxieties about energy and exhaustion. This was a society caught in the gears of the Industrial Revolution, where schedules grew longer, work more relentless, and leisure itself demanded performance. Aristocrats might not have labored in factories, but their social calendars could be punishing in their own way. To attend parties, host dinners, visit theatres, maintain appearances, and always sparkle with wit and grace, this too was a form of labour, and cocaine became a secret weapon in the battle against fatigue. Doctors spoke of neurasthenia, a fashionable diagnosis for the fatigue, depression, and nervous complaints of the upper classes. Cocaine was often prescribed as a cure. Patients reported bursts of vitality, lifted moods, sharpened focus. For a time, it seemed like the perfect answer to the peculiar ailments of modern life. What no one wanted to admit was that the relief was temporary and the costs mounting. Artists and writers found particular allure in the drug. The Finder cycle was a time of artistic rebellion when painters, poets, and novelists pushed against the constraints of Victorian morality. Cocaine, like absinthe, became part of the mythology of decadence. It offered escape, intensity, and the promise of inspiration. The very restlessness it created seemed to mirror the restless spirit of the age. Some believed it unlocked creativity, others that it fueled endurance. But beneath the brilliance lay a growing shadow, as addiction gnawed at both body and mind. One can imagine the scene, a smoky drawing room in Mayfair, velvet drapes drawn against the night. Gentlemen in tailored suits and ladies in silk gowns lean close around a table. A fine mirror lies flat, white powder arranged in perfect lines. Laughter spills through the air as the powder disappears, followed by renewed conversation, bright eyes, rapid gestures. To the participants, it is not debauchery, but refinement, a secret ritual of the modern elite. And yet, in another quarter of the city, a very different scene unfolds. A patient in a clinic trembles with insomnia, unable to eat, consumed by the very substance society hails as miraculous. The paradox deepened as the drug seeped into more corners of daily life. Pharmacists sold cocaine in over-the-counter remedies for everything from indigestion to toothache. Travelers carried it as a remedy for seasickness. Explorers packed it for stamina. Soldiers, too, would soon discover its capacity to banish fatigue on the battlefield. The battlefield. What had begun as a luxury of the elite spread outward, creeping into the lives of clerks, shopkeepers, even labourers who could afford a small dose from the chemist. Cocaine was no longer confined to drawing rooms. It was becoming part of the very fabric of modern existence. And yet, high society clung to its claim on the drug's glamour. In their world, cocaine was still a symbol of privilege, a ritual that marked them as distinct from the masses. That distinction, however, was eroding. The very accessibility of cocaine began to threaten its exclusivity. What good was a badge of modernity if it could be purchased by anyone with a few shillings? For the elite, cocaine's growing spread was both a source of pride and a quiet unease. It was during this period that the darker side of the craze began to emerge more visibly. Newspapers occasionally reported on tragedies linked to cocaine overdoses. Doctors documented cases of cocaine mania, describing patients overcome by paranoia, hallucinations, and violent impulses. Stories circulated of once brilliant men reduced to wrecks, of once elegant women wasting away. The same society that had glorified the drug now began to whisper about its dangers, even as it continued to indulge. The contradictions multiplied. Cocaine was at once a medicine and a menace, a fashion and a curse, a symbol of progress and a harbinger of decline. It mirrored the Victorian age itself, outwardly confident, inwardly anxious, proud of its achievements, yet haunted by fears of collapse. The craze was not just about a drug, but about a culture struggling to balance its soaring ambitions with its hidden vulnerabilities. By the closing years of the 19th century, the first movements toward regulation began to stir. Governments could not ignore the mounting evidence of harm, and medical opinion shifted toward caution. Yet for all the warnings, the memory of cocaine's glamour persisted. It was too deeply tied to the mythology of an era to vanish overnight. For some, it remained a guilty pleasure. For others, a haunting reminder of society's capacity for self-deception. As the century turned, the Victorian cocaine craze stood as both triumph and tragedy, triumph in the discovery of new medical possibilities, tragedy in the blindness to their costs. What had begun as a miracle ended as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the brightest jewels of progress can conceal poison at their core. And so, in the annals of history, the image endures. A powder laid out on silver trays, consumed beneath chandeliers, whispered about in salons. The forgotten cocaine craze of Victorian high society was not simply a dalliance with a drug. It was a mirror of an age intoxicated with itself, convinced it could master anything, only to discover that some forces cannot be so easily tamed. By the dawn of the 20th century, the glow of Victorian cocaine culture was beginning to fade. The bright sheen of discovery and novelty that had once surrounded the drug was dulled by the mounting evidence of its destructive power. What had been celebrated as a marvel of science was now increasingly spoken of with unease, sometimes even horror. But for a brief and telling moment, cocaine had been woven into the very fabric of elite society, leaving behind stories, scandals, and lessons that history almost forgot. The changing tide was not sudden. For years, defenders of cocaine clung to its reputation as a gift of progress. Doctors who had built their careers on its promotion were reluctant to admit its dangers. Socialites who had woven it into their identities resisted acknowledging its costs. Yet the evidence grew undeniable. Patients collapsed in doctors' offices with trembling hands and hollow eyes. Soldiers, dosed with cocaine to endure long marches, returned with shattered nerves. Families whispered about relatives whose vitality had turned into mania. The same newspapers that once ran advertisements for cocaine lozenges now carried stories of ruin. Still, within the drawing rooms of high society, denial lingered. For many aristocrats, cocaine was too deeply tied to their self-image to abandon easily. To reject it would be to admit they had been duped, that their sophistication had been nothing more than folly. And so, in hushed corners, the powder continued to be shared, no longer flaunted, but kept in quiet circulation. What was once a badge of modernity became instead a secret, a guilty indulgence. The fall of cocaine's reputation mirrored the fall of the Victorian dream itself. The late 19th century had been an age of certainty, of confidence in empire, science, and moral order. But as the new century unfolded, that certainty began to fracture. The Boer War exposed the vulnerabilities of British might. Social unrest stirred in the streets. New scientific discoveries, like Freud's own theories of the unconscious, revealed that even the human mind was not as orderly as Victorians had believed. In this context, cocaine no longer seemed like the emblem of progress. Instead, it looked like a symbol of hubris, a reminder of how easily the pursuit of perfection could lead to ruin. Literature of the time captured this shifting mood. In earlier decades, cocaine had appeared in stories as a curious detail, a quirk of modern life. But as the dangers became clear, writers began to use it as a symbol of decline. Decadent characters sniffed powder before tumbling into madness. Villains used it as a tool of control or corruption. The white crystals, once associated with clarity and brilliance, now came to represent fragility, deception, and moral decay. Sherlock Holmes himself became a cautionary figure, his cocaine use increasingly interpreted not as eccentric genius, but as a troubling flaw. The medical profession, too, turned against its former darling. Articles that once sang cocaine's praises now warned of its risks, sometimes in alarmist tones. The same journals that had encouraged doctors to prescribe it widely now cautioned against its use, except in the strictest of circumstances. By the early 1900s, legislation began to restrict its sale, and the open advertisements that had once promised miracles disappeared from newspapers and shop windows. And yet, even as cocaine was pushed underground, the memory of its heyday lingered. Among the wealthy, it remained part of the cultural imagination, a relic of an age of grandeur and excess. For those who had lived through it, the craze carried a strange nostalgia, a reminder of glittering nights when science seemed unstoppable and pleasures knew no bounds. For those looking back, it offered a cautionary tale about the blindness of privilege and the dangers of unchecked faith in progress. In many ways, the cocaine craze of Victorian high society was less about the drug itself and more about the world that embraced it. Cocaine did not create the contradictions of the age, it merely exposed them. The Victorians longed for energy but feared weakness, craved pleasure but preached restraint, trusted science but misunderstood its limits. Cocaine seemed to answer all these longings at once, and so they welcomed it with open arms, blind to the cost. The irony is stark. The irony is stark. The same society that condemned the working classes for their gin and the sailors for their opium embraced its own stimulant with a sense of superiority. Respectability shielded the elite from criticism, even as their indulgence mirrored the very behaviors they scorned in others. Cocaine, in this sense, was not just a drug but a symbol of hypocrisy, one rule for the masses, another for the privileged. As the Edwardian era dawned, the legacy of the Victorian cocaine craze became part of a larger story of social change. The rigid hierarchies of the 19th century began to loosen, and with them, the illusions that had sustained them. Cocaine slipped from silver trays into shadows, its glamour tarnished, its dangers undeniable. But its story remained, tucked into the margins of history, a reminder that every age has its intoxicants, every society its blind spots. When we look back now, the image that endures is not of laboratories or medical journals, but of glittering halls where powder shimmered under chandeliers, where aristocrats whispered of vitality and brilliance, unaware that they were playing with fire and with fire. The forgotten cocaine craze of Victorian high society is not just a curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting the eternal human desire to escape limitations, to find magic in the modern, to believe that progress can conquer even the fragility of flesh and mind. And in that mirror, perhaps, we see ourselves, for though the fashions and substances may change, the pattern remains. The same eagerness to embrace new miracles, the same blindness to their costs, the same faith that science will save us. The Victorians had their cocaine, we have our own marvels and dangers. Their story is not merely history, it is a caution whispered across time, reminding us that every age has its powders, its potions, its illusions. The decline of cocaine in Victorian high society was not simply the end of a fad. It marked the close of an era, a shift from the boundless optimism of the 19th century to the sobering realities of the 20th. What had once glittered under chandeliers became a shadow cast across the memory of the age, and yet, like all intoxicants, it left its mark not only on individuals, but on culture itself. By the early 1900s, cocaine had begun to acquire the reputation it still carries today, a dangerous vice, a substance linked with ruin rather than refinement. Laws tightened, medical prescriptions narrowed, and the open celebration of the drug vanished from polite society. But the memory of its former glory persisted, lingering like a ghost in literature, gossip, and the whispered recollections of those who had once danced in its spell. The Victorian craze for cocaine was in many ways an experiment, one conducted not in laboratories but in the drawing rooms and salons of the elite. It was a test of how far society could stretch its faith in science, its hunger for novelty, and its need for escape. And for a time the experiment seemed successful. Cocaine promised energy without drunkenness, clarity without stupor, brilliance without effort. It was the perfect illusion for a class obsessed with appearances, performance, and control. But illusions, by their very nature, cannot last. Beneath the sparkling surface lay exhaustion, paranoia, and dependence. The drug that had promised to free its users from weakness instead bound them to new forms of fragility. And in this way, cocaine became a metaphor for the Victorian age itself, an age that believed it could conquer all limits, only to discover its own vulnerabilities. To understand the forgotten cocaine craze is to understand the psychology of an era. The Victorians were not fools. They were human, caught in the same tensions that still shape us today. They longed for remedies to pain, cures for fatigue, escapes from the burdens of daily life. They trusted in progress, in science, in the idea that the future would always bring improvement. Cocaine offered all these promises in a crystalline form, and so they embraced it, just as we might embrace new technologies or therapies today. The difference is only one of substance, not of spirit. And yet, it would be too simple to dismiss the craze as mere folly. For even in its dangers, cocaine played a role in advancing medicine. Its use as a local anesthetic revolutionized surgery, sparing patients agony and paving the way for safer procedures. Its study forced doctors to confront the realities of dependency and the complexities of the human nervous system. The lessons learned in the Victorian cocaine era informed later understandings of addiction, pharmacology, and the ethical limits of medical enthusiasm. What remains most striking, however, is the social theatre that surrounded the drug. Cocaine was never just about chemistry, it was about image. To take cocaine in a Victorian ballroom was to participate in a ritual of modernity, to display one's membership in a world of refinement and progress. The silver spoons, the mirrored trays, the whispered toasts, all of these transformed the act of consumption into a performance, one that told a story about who the participants were and who they wished to be. That story, of course, unravelled, mavelled. By the time cocaine was fully recognised as dangerous, the same rituals that had once seemed glamorous appeared decadent, even grotesque. What had been a symbol of vitality became instead a symbol of decline. And in this reversal lies the moral heart of the tale, that the very things we celebrate as triumphs can, with time, reveal themselves as traps. For historians, the forgotten cocaine craze is more than a curiosity. It is a window into the hidden lives of the elite, a reminder that behind the polished portraits and grand estates lay vulnerabilities as real as those of the poorest labourer. Addiction respected no class boundaries, even if society tried to pretend otherwise. The Duchess and the dockworker were not so different after all, both seeking relief in substances that promised escape. And perhaps this is why the story has been so easily forgotten. To remember the cocaine craze is to remember the hypocrisy of an age that condemned the vices of the poor while indulging in its own. It is to see the fragility behind the grandeur, the weakness behind the confidence. For an empire that prided itself on strength and order, such memories were inconvenient. easier perhaps to let them fade into silence. But history has a way of resurfacing its forgotten chapters. Today, as we look back, the cocaine craze of Victorian high society speaks to us not only as a tale of the past, but as a warning for the present. It reminds us that progress can blind as well as enlighten, that every miracle carries a shadow, and that the desire to escape the limits of our bodies and minds is as dangerous as it is universal. Picture once more the ballroom, the glow of gaslight, the shimmer of gowns, the murmur of voices, the sparkle of powder on a silver tray. For a moment, it seemed the very essence of sophistication, the pinnacle of modern living. And yet, hidden in that scene is the seed of collapse, the fragile truth that no substance, no matter how refined, can truly free us from ourselves. The forgotten cocaine craze of Victorian high society is not just about a drug. It is about the human condition, our endless search for remedies, our hunger for wonder, our blindness to consequences. It is about the allure of progress and the peril of believing too deeply in its promises. And it is about the simple truth that even the most glittering illusions must eventually dissolve, leaving behind not brilliance but lessons, not vitality but memory. So when we recall the Victorians with their stern portraits and rigid manners, let us also remember the powder that sparkled in their parlours, the craze that whispered through their nights. Let us remember that behind the facade of respectability lay a fascination with escape, with energy, with transcendence. And let us remember that in their story we may glimpse our own. For history is never only about the past. It is a mirror held up to the present, reflecting not just what was, but what is and what may yet be. And in that mirror, the cocaine craze of Victorian high society stands as a glittering, haunting reminder that every age has its green fairy, its silver spoon, its crystal powder. Every age believes for a time that it has found the key to endless vitality, and every age must learn, sooner or later, that no powder, no potion, no progress can ever grant the immortality it seeks. The Victorians longed to believe in miracles, to believe that science could free them from pain, sorrow and fatigue. Cocaine, in its brief reign, embodied that longing. Its fall was not just the fall of a drug, but the fall of an illusion that progress alone could save humanity from its limits. And yet, even in that fall, lessons endured. The caution learned from cocaine would shape the development of future medicines. The awareness of addiction would influence how societies approached other substances. The recognition of science's fallibility would temper the blind faith of earlier decades. In this sense, the cocaine craze was not only a cautionary tale, but also a teacher, one whose lessons echo far beyond the Victorian age. The memory of cocaine in high society also serves a reminder of the fragility of reputation. This cycle of rise and fall, glamour, excess, decline, would repeat itself in countless other cultural phenomena, from jazz-age cocktails to mid-century cigarettes to the stimulants of the digital age. The Victorians were not unique in their illusions. They were merely the first to stage them on such a glittering stage. As we reflect on this forgotten chapter, perhaps the most haunting aspect is not the drug itself, but the mirror it holds up to us. The Victorians were convinced they had found the key to endless vitality, just as every generation since has believed in its own miracles. Whether in powders, pills, or technologies, the pattern is the same: discovery, enthusiasm, excess, disillusionment. Cocaine was their symbol of modernity, just as our own age has its own. The story invites us to ask, what are our illusions? What powders sparkle under the chandeliers of our own time? In the end, the cocaine craze of Victorian high society is both a tale of the past and a parable for the present. It reminds us that progress is never without cost, that brilliance can hide decay, and that the desire to escape human limits is as old as humanity itself. The Victorians, with their chandeliers and silver trays, their doctors and poets, their faith and blindness, were not so different from us. Their story is not only theirs, it is ours told in another age, in another language, through another powder. And so, the ballroom fades, the gaslight dims, the music slows. The trays are cleared, the guests depart, and the powder remains only as memory, white crystals dissolving into history. But in the silence that follows, the lesson lingers. That every age has its cocaine, every society its forgotten craze, every generation its dangerous dream, dressed in the garments of progress. The story of cocaine in Victorian high society does not end neatly with prohibition or decline. History rarely closes its chapters so cleanly. Instead, the legacy of this craze rippled forward, resurfacing in new forms, in new decades, in new disguises. To understand its continuation is to trace the undercurrents that connect the Victorians' powdered illusions to our own age of stimulants and restless ambition. By the early 20th century, cocaine had slipped from the polished drawing rooms of London and Paris into more shadowed spaces. And what had once been a badge of refinement became, in the public imagination, the mark of decadence, of moral decline. Yet the substance itself did not vanish. Artists still experimented with it, criminals found profit in it, and doctors, though chastened, continued to explore its uses in controlled medical contexts. The crystal powder remained a companion to humanity, though now cloaked in secrecy. For the upper classes, the cocaine craze became a story best left untold. Families who had once boasted of their physicians' modern remedies began to quietly remove such details from their memoirs. Biographers of the late Victorian elite often glossed over the subject, preferring to highlight philanthropy, travel, or literary pursuits rather than indulgence in stimulants. The very fact that the craze is forgotten today speaks to this deliberate erasure. Cocaine had become an embarrassment, a reminder of misplaced confidence and reckless modernity. Yet memory is never so easily buried. Traces of the craze lingered in literature, in the marginalia of medical journals, in whispered family anecdotes. Sherlock Holmes, with his 7% solution, remained one of the most enduring cultural echoes of the period. Readers could not quite forget the image of the brilliant detective turning to cocaine in moments of boredom. Fiction preserved what polite society sought to conceal. But there was another, subtler way in which the cocaine craze lived on. It shaped how the West imagined the relationship between class and intoxication. In the Victorian era, alcohol had long been associated with the working classes, with public drunkenness and disorder. Cocaine, by contrast, had been embraced by the elite, framed as a clean alternative, a stimulant that avoided the vulgarity of the tavern. The fall of cocaine shattered this division, reminding society that addiction respected no class boundaries. When the substance later re-emerged in the 20th century, its users came from all backgrounds, and its reputation carried the residue of this earlier revelation. No one was immune. The Victorians themselves might not have understood addiction as we do today, but they lived through its reality. Accounts from the period describe individuals who grew restless without their daily doses, who became irritable, paranoid, or ill when deprived of the powder. These were early glimpses of dependency, though the language to describe it had not yet solidified. In some sense, the forgotten cocaine craze was also the birthplace of modern addiction studies, a painful but necessary step in recognizing the human mind's vulnerabilities. Beyond the medical and cultural legacies, the cocaine craze offers a psychological window into the age. The Victorians were a people in transition, straddling the certainties of tradition and the uncertainties of modern science. They lived in a world where electricity was transforming cities, where railways collapsed distances, where Darwin had unsettled humanity's place in creation. Cocaine, with its crystalline promise of energy and clarity, fit perfectly into this moment of upheaval. It was not just a drug, it was a metaphor for the age's desire to master change, to remain in control, even as the ground shifted beneath their feet. In that sense, the craze was less about pleasure than about power. For the elite, cocaine offered the stamina to maintain appearances, to perform endlessly at balls, salons and dinners, to outlast rivals in the ceaseless competition of social life. It promised efficiency, brilliance and composure, the very qualities demanded of a ruling class determined to project strength. To partake was not only to indulge but to equip oneself for the theatre of high society. In this way, cocaine was woven into the very fabric of Victorian ambition. And yet, ambition always comes at a cost. Behind the polished faces and elegant attire, many found themselves drained, unable to function without the powder, consumed by the very stimulant that had promised control. The irony is striking. Cocaine, embraced as a tool of mastery, instead revealed the limits of mastery itself. It showed that beneath the layers of etiquette and power, the human body remained fragile, subject to cravings and collapse. The forgotten cocaine craze also reminds us of the dangers of selective memory. By allowing this chapter to fade from public consciousness, history risked losing not only the details of aristocratic indulgence, but the lessons contained within. To remember is to confront the uncomfortable truth that progress is double-edged, that science can dazzle and deceive in equal measure. To forget is to repeat the same patterns, dressed in new costumes. Indeed, when one examines later decades, the jazz-fueled 1920s, the rebellious 1960s, the hyper-driven 1980s, the parallels are unmistakable. Each age finds its stimulant, its powder or pill or potion that promises liberation and brilliance. Each age embraces the illusion, only to learn again the cost of excess. In this sense, the Victorians were not only participants in their own story, but precursors of ours. Their cocaine was our amphetamine, our caffeine, our energy drink, our nootropic. The names change, the rituals evolve, but the underlying hunger remains the same. Thus, the forgotten craze is not so forgotten after all. It pulses beneath the surface of modern life, a reminder that we are never far from repeating the Victorians' dance. Their chandeliers may be gone, their silver spoons tucked away, but their longings, their desire to transcend fatigue, to escape boredom, to shine just a little brighter, remain alive in us. To imagine the end of the craze is to imagine not only the silence of the ballroom, but the persistence of the dream. For as long as humans seek shortcuts to energy, brilliance and transcendence, the ghost of the Victorian cocaine craze will haunt us, whispering its lessons and its warnings. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. The story does not end. It lives in every new miracle drug, every gleaming promise, every headline that declares a breakthrough only to be followed, years later, by caution. The powder of the Victorians may have faded, but the pattern endures. The chandeliers dim, the trays are cleared, yet the hunger remains timeless, insatiable, eternal. Each generation repeats the steps, dressing them in its own cultural styles but rarely breaking free. The cocaine craze of Victorian high society was the first act of this endless play, a rehearsal for the dramas that would follow. And yet, to view the craze only as a cautionary tale is to miss its complexity. For in its very excess, the Victorian experiment revealed profound truths about human aspiration. It showed how deeply we long to push beyond our natural boundaries, how much we crave control over time, fatigue, and emotion. It revealed the paradox that progress, even at its brightest, can open doors to darkness. The Victorians, in their embrace of cocaine, were not simply indulgent. They were explorers, testing the limits of what it meant to be human in an age of transformation. Their exploration was flawed, yes, and often tragic, but it was also pioneering. Without their reckless enthusiasm, medicine might not have advanced as it did. Without their indulgence, literature and culture might have lacked some of their most vivid metaphors for modernity's contradiction. Even in their errors, the Victorians left behind a legacy of insight, though one purchased at a heavy cost. As the decades rolled on, the cocaine craze faded from collective memory, overshadowed by new obsessions, new crises, new wars, yet history has a way of circling back. When cocaine re-emerged in later eras, whether in the smoky clubs of the 1920s, the Bohemian scenes of the 1960s, or the high-powered boardrooms of the 1980s, it carried with it the ghost of its Victorian past. Few remembered the silver trays and chandeliers, but the rhythm was the same, the hunger unchanged. The forgotten cocaine craze is thus not only a story of a single age, but a thread woven through the fabric of modern history. To trace it is to trace the continuity of human longing, the unbroken chain of our attempts to conquer fatigue, amplify brilliance, and escape the confines of our own biology. The Victorians, with their powdered illusions, were not merely a curious footnote. They were the beginning of a story we are still living. And so as the lights dim once more, as the mirrored trays vanish into the shadows of memory, the lesson lingers. Cocaine's Victorian chapter may be forgotten, but its echoes remain. The chandeliers may have gone dark, but the hunger that lit them burns still, flickering in every new stimulant, every new promise, every new illusion of endless vitality. The past, it seems, has never truly passed. It lingers in the powders of yesterday and the pills of today, in the chandeliers of the ballroom and the neon lights of the city. The forgotten cocaine craze of Victorian high society is not forgotten at all. It is simply waiting for us to recognize it in history, in culture, and in ourselves. The further one travels from the Victorian ballroom, the more the cocaine craze begins to feel less like an isolated chapter of history and more like the prologue to a story that continues to unfold. The faces have changed, the settings have shifted, but the themes remain stubbornly familiar. The hunger for vitality, the seduction of science, the blindness to consequence. To explore this forgotten craze is not only to examine the past, but to hold a mirror to the present. When we look back at Victorian high society, it is tempting to see only extravagance and folly, the powdered noses, the silver spoons, the glittering chandeliers. It can all seem like the indulgence of a privileged class, out of touch with the realities of the world beyond their gilded walls. Yet, to stop at this judgment is to miss the deeper resonance. For beneath the excess lay a truth that speaks across the ages. The universal desire to transcend the body's limits, to seize more life than nature grants. This desire has always shaped human history. In ancient times, it took the form of fermented brews, sacred herbs, or mystical elixirs. In the Victorians' world, it appeared as crystalline powder, dressed in the language of science and refinement. Today, it surfaces in pharmaceuticals, energy drinks, digital enhancements, and nootropics. The form shifts, the rituals evolve, but the yearning is constant. The cocaine craze of Victorian high society was not an aberration. It was a chapter in the ongoing human quest to outrun mortality. In this sense, the craze teaches us more than just caution. It teaches us humility. For if even the most refined, educated, and powerful figures of their age could be seduced by the illusion of endless vitality, what protects us from the same mistake? The Victorians were not foolish caricatures. They were people of ambition and optimism, no less intelligent or discerning than we. Their blindness was not theirs alone. It is a blindness that belongs to us all, one that emerges whenever hope outpaces wisdom. The aftermath of the craze revealed this lesson in subtle ways. By the time cocaine was fully discredited as a fashionable stimulant, the same society that had once embraced it turned toward new illusions. Electricity became a metaphor for boundless energy. Machines promised to extend human capacity. Later, pharmaceuticals offered new remedies for fatigue and depression. The Victorians abandoned cocaine, but they did not abandon the longing that had drawn them to it. That longing simply found new vessels. Perhaps this is why the cocaine craze has been so thoroughly buried in memory. To remember it too vividly would be to recognize ourselves within it. Easier, perhaps, to dismiss it as a folly of the past, a curiosity of a bygone age. But the truth is less comfortable. The chandeliers may have dimmed, but the dance continues. We are still the Victorians, still reaching for powders and potions, still believing in shortcuts to transcendence. This continuity also complicates the way we think about morality and indulgence. The Victorians themselves struggled with this tension, praising cocaine as progress while whispering about its dangers. Their descendants, in turn, condemned cocaine while embracing other stimulants. But what becomes clear when the longer arc is considered is that morality often lags behind desire. We rarely evaluate new miracles with balanced judgment. More often, we rush toward them with open arms and only later count the cost. Cocaine's story is not simply about excess. It is about the perennial imbalance between enthusiasm and wisdom. The irony is that cocaine, for all its dangers, did achieve some of the very promises it had made. As a medical anesthetic, it spared countless patients from agony. As a subject of study, it advanced our understanding of neurology and addiction. Even in its fall, it contributed to the development of more cautious systems of regulation and testing. In this way, the Victorian craze was not a total failure. It was a flawed but necessary step in the larger progress of science. The glittering powder may have deceived, but it also taught, and its lessons endure. Yet the cultural memory of the craze remains elusive. Unlike the great wars or political upheavals of the age, the cocaine craze leaves behind no monuments, no official commemorations. Its traces survive only in literature, in scattered reports, in the faint outlines of scandalous gossip. It is history's shadow lurking just beyond the polished portraits of Victorian respectability, and perhaps that is fitting, for stimulants themselves are shadows, ephemeral bursts of light followed by darkness, brilliance that fades into fragility. The craze was never meant to be remembered as a triumph. It was always destined to be a whisper, a ghost at the edges of the ballroom. And yet, the ghost has something to tell us. It warns us not only of the dangers of excess, but of the perils of forgetting. For in forgetting, we blind ourselves to the patterns that govern our own age. The Victorians' cocaine is our caffeine, our Adderall, our endless stream of artificial enhancements. Theirs was a ballroom lit by gaslight. Ours is a world glowing with screens, Sprewians. The settings differ, but the yearning is the same. To cheat time, to exceed nature, to feel more alive than life allows. The cocaine craze of Victorian high society, then, is less a closed story than a parable. It is a reminder that progress and peril often arrive in the same package, that every miracle carries its shadow, and that human longing is both our greatest strength and our most dangerous weakness. To study it is not to laugh at the follies of the past, but to prepare ourselves for the illusions of the future. So let the ballroom linger in your mind. The swirl of gowns, the murmur of conversation, the shimmer of crystal powder under chandeliers. Let it linger, not as a curiosity, but as a mirror. For in that image lies a truth that belongs to every age, the glitter of progress, the intoxication of discovery, the blindness of desire, and the inevitable reckoning that follows. The forgotten cocaine craze is forgotten only by those who do not wish to see its reflection staring back at them. And as the music fades, as the powder dissolves into the silence of history, the lesson remains. The Victorians may be gone, but their hunger lives on, in us. The forgotten cocaine craze of Victorian high society closes not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet fading. Unlike wars or revolutions, it left behind no definitive moment of conclusion. There was no grand decree that ended it, no single scandal that shattered its allure. Instead, it dissolved like the powder itself, swept away by shifting fashions, stricter laws, and the slow recognition of its dangers. And yet, even in fading, it left traces too profound to erase. To reflect on this craze is to step into the paradox of progress. The Victorians lived in an age intoxicated by discovery. Electricity lit their cities, railways shrank their world. Darwin redefined their place in the cosmos. Cocaine fits seamlessly into this atmosphere of wonder, a substance that promised to conquer fatigue, sharpen the mind, ease pain, and open new frontiers of experience. For a time, it seemed the perfect emblem of a civilization on the rise. But just as quickly, it revealed the cost of unchecked enthusiasm. The craze reminds us that every age has its illusions. The Victorians believed that white crystals could deliver boundless vitality. Later generations believed that industrial machines could conquer nature, that technology could solve every human problem, that digital networks could connect us into harmony. Each illusion carries truth, but each also carries danger. The cocaine craze, forgotten though it may be, is a stark reminder that progress and peril always intertwined. It is also a reminder of class and power. Cocaine was not discovered in the ballrooms. It was extracted by laborers in far-off colonies, packaged and shipped through networks of empire, and only then transformed into a toy of the elite. The drug's glamour was built on invisible toil, much as the empire's wealth was built on the unseen labor of millions. To study the craze is therefore to confront the hidden hierarchies that underpinned Victorian society, the polished surface concealing the exploitation beneath. The powder sparkled on silver trays, but its journey to those trays was marked by hardship and inequity. As cocaine faded from fashion, high society worked to erase its memory. Families destroyed letters, memoirists skipped over uncomfortable details, and official histories turned their gaze elsewhere. Respectability demanded forgetting. But culture has a way of preserving what society wishes to bury. In the figure of Sherlock Holmes, in the whispers of decadent poets, in the scattered reports of scandal, the ghost of cocaine remained. The Victorians themselves may have tried to forget, but history does not forget so easily, and so we remember not simply to marvel at the follies of the past, but to recognize ourselves within them. For we too live in an age of dazzling progress and hidden peril. We too embrace new miracles with uncritical enthusiasm. We too long to escape fatigue, pain, and the ordinary limits of our bodies. The Victorians' chandeliers have been replaced by our neon lights, their powders by our pills and digital enhancements. But the hunger is the same, and the pattern repeats, and the pattern repeats. The final lesson of the cocaine craze, then, is not merely about a drug. It is about human nature. It is about the eternal tension between aspiration and limitation, between hope and humility. Cocaine was not only a substance, it was a symbol of our refusal to accept weakness, our determination to push beyond the boundaries of what is natural. The tragedy of the Victorians is that in seeking to master life, they instead discovered fragility. But the tragedy is also ours, for we walk the same path, again and again, convinced that this time will be different. It is the recognition that beneath those images lies something timeless. The human struggle with mortality, fatigue, and the desire to be more than we are. The Victorians dressed their longing in crystal powder and silver spoons. We dress ours in other forms, but the longing itself does not change. And so, as the story draws to its close, let us imagine once more the ballroom. The chandeliers shimmer, the orchestra plays, the gowns swirl across polished floors. A tray passes quietly, discreetly, and on it lies the powder that symbolizes an age's faith in progress. For a moment, all seems perfect, life without limits, brilliance without cost. But then the music slows, the chandeliers dim, and the guests depart. What remains is not the powder, nor the promise, but the lesson that every glittering illusion dissolves, that every miracle has its shadow, that every age must learn humility in the face of its own desires. The forgotten cocaine craze of Victorian high society is forgotten no longer. It speaks across the years, reminding us that history's most important lessons often lie not in its grand battles or political triumphs, but in the quiet corners of its decadence. For it is there, in the powdered illusions of a long-vanished ballroom, that we glimpse ourselves most clearly. And perhaps that is the true ending of the story, not in the decline of cocaine, nor in the moral condemnations that followed, but in the recognition that history is not distant, it is present, alive, mirrored in our own choices. Their hunger is our hunger, their illusions our illusions. To remember them is to remember ourselves. The chandeliers are dark now, the powder dissolved, the guests long departed, but the echo of their laughter, the shimmer of their illusions lingers still, in memory, in culture, and in the restless heartbeat of every age that follows.